I'm 21 years old, home from college for the summer, and I haven't had a full night's sleep in 4 days. Looking back now, I keep replaying the moment everything began. At the time, it seemed so ordinary that I never imagined it would become the first chapter of something that still makes my stomach twist. About 2 weeks ago, I stopped by the small family-owned bagel shop a few minutes from my house. I'd been going there for years. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where nothing bad ever seemed like it could happen. I always ordered the same breakfast sandwich, and sometimes I'd grab an extra dozen bagels to bring home for my family. That morning around 10, no a.m., business was slow. As soon as I stepped inside, I noticed a young employee behind the counter. He looked to be around 24 or 25. He greeted me politely, but something about the way he looked at me felt unusually focused, not flirtatious, not friendly. Just intensely observant, as if he were trying to memorize every detail of my face before I'd even spoken a word. I shrugged the feeling off. After all, people make eye contact. I placed my usual order and reached into my wallet for my credit card. That's when disaster struck. Every coin I'd been carrying exploded across the tile floor. The clattering echoed through the quiet shop, bouncing off the walls far louder than it should have. My face instantly burned with embarrassment. Before I even had time to kneel down, the employee hurried out from behind the counter. "No, it's okay, I got it," I insisted, already crouching to gather the coins. But he ignored me. Without hesitation, he knelt beside me and began picking them up one by one. As I reached for another quarter, I noticed one of his fingers was swollen and wrapped awkwardly with athletic tape. The skin around the knuckle was bruised purple. I felt even worse. "I'm so sorry," I said. "You really don't have to help." He simply smiled without looking up. "It's fine." Trying to fill the awkward silence, I asked what had happened to his hand. He zilled, "Dislocated it playing rugby." That led to a short conversation. Nothing memorable. I asked how long he'd been playing, what position he played, and whether he'd have to miss any games. He answered casually while handing me the last of my scattered coins. It was the kind of meaningless small talk you forget 5 minutes later, or at least I thought I would. I paid, thanked him again, wished him a good day, and left. By that afternoon, I'd completely forgotten about the entire encounter, until my phone buzzed. I absent-mindedly opened Instagram after seeing a new follower notification. Without thinking, I tapped the profile. The moment his picture loaded, every muscle in my body went cold. It was him, the employee from the bagel shop. For several long seconds, I just stared at the screen, trying to convince myself I had the wrong person. But I didn't. Same face, same eyes, same smile. A wave of confusion hit me first. Then came something much worse. How did he find me? My Instagram uses my real first and last name, so technically anyone could locate it if they knew who I was. But that was exactly the problem. I had never told him my name. The only conversation we'd shared had been about his injured finger in rugby. Nothing else. My mind immediately began racing through every possible explanation. Had he glanced at my credit card while I was paying? Did my full name appear somewhere on the register? Was it printed on the receipt? Maybe, but each explanation somehow felt less comforting than the last, because none of them explained why he would go looking for me in the first place. Trying not to overreact, I removed him from my followers list and put my phone away. I told myself it was probably harmless. Maybe he thought I was attractive. Maybe he just had poor boundaries. Maybe I was reading too much into it. 30 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. Another notification. He had followed me a second time. This time, there was also a direct message waiting. My chest tightened as I opened it. The first sentence read, "I hope it's not weird that I found your Instagram." Before I could even process that, my eyes drifted to the next line. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since you came into the shop." Something about those words made every instinct inside me scream that this wasn't normal. Not because someone had messaged me, not because someone had flirted with me, but because somehow a brief 5-minute interaction, a conversation that barely extended beyond spilled coins and an injured finger, had convinced a complete stranger to search for me online, ignore being removed, and immediately reach out again. It was as if the encounter I'd already forgotten had never actually ended for him. It had only just begun. That's when the fear truly began. It wasn't simply that I didn't know him. I'm a performer. Because of my work in music and theater, my social media has always been public. Random strangers follow me all the time. Creepy messages, weird comments. Unfortunately, I'd learned to ignore them years ago. But this wasn't a stranger hiding behind a screen. This was someone who had stood only inches away from me. Someone who knew what I looked like in real life. Someone whose workplace was less than 10 minutes from my house. The internet suddenly wasn't the scary part anymore. The real world was trying to convince myself I was overreacting. I blocked his account. I remember staring at the screen after pressing the button, actually feeling relieved. There, I thought. That's the end of it. I couldn't have been more wrong. A few days later, my summer schedule became hectic again. I worked from 7:30 inches the morning until 3:00 inches the afternoon, then headed straight to rehearsals for a theater production from 6:00 until 10:00 every night. For a while, life almost felt normal again, until my lunch break. I unlocked my phone absent-mindedly. The notification count exploded across my screen. Dozens, then more. The same man had created another Instagram account. He wasn't just following me anymore. He was systematically liking nearly every post I'd ever uploaded. Photo after photo, video after video. Old memories buried months and even years deep were suddenly receiving notifications all at once. More than 50 of them. It felt less like social media activity, and more like someone methodically digging through my life. Then came the messages. "You look beautiful. I don't understand why you blocked me. I just want to know you. I'm not a bad guy. I've been thinking about you non-stop." The tone sounded polite on the surface, but underneath it was something that made my stomach tighten. He wasn't asking. He was refusing to accept being ignored. I blocked that account too. For a brief moment, I hoped he'd finally get the message. Instead, things escalated. That evening, rehearsals started as usual. I forced myself to concentrate on my lines, trying to push the entire situation to the back of my mind. 5 minutes into our scheduled break, I checked my phone again. I wish I hadn't. Over 100 new notifications. He had found me again. Not just Instagram this time. Snapchat, TikTok, every public platform I had. It was as though someone had taken my entire digital footprint and mapped it out piece by piece. Every TikTok I'd posted, every forgotten video, every late-night upload from 2022. He had liked all of them. The realization hit me like ice water. He hadn't stumbled across my profiles. He had spent hours searching for them, hours scrolling through years of my life. The direct messages were even worse. Gone was the awkward politeness. His tone had changed. It was impatient, demanding, aggressive. "Why won't you answer me? Why do you keep blocking me? I had to make another account because of you. You looked really pretty today. I saw you on Hinge. Why didn't you match with me? You owe me one response." Message after message after message, each one arriving only minutes apart, each one sounding more irritated than the last. My pulse hammered so loudly I could barely hear the conversations happening around me. I just stood there in complete silence, staring at the screen. My mind kept circling one terrifying question. How much did this man actually know about me? The rest of rehearsal passed in a blur. I don't remember my cues. I don't remember the choreography. I don't remember conversations with the cast. I remember only one thing, wanting the night to be over. When rehearsal finally ended around 10:00 p.m., I grabbed my bag and headed toward the stage door. Outside, the parking lot was almost completely dark. Most of the cast had already left. The silence felt unnaturally heavy. I wrapped my keys tightly between my fingers the way women are taught to do, scanning every shadow as I stepped outside. I had taken only a few steps when something moved beside my car. I froze. A dark figure, standing near the driver's side window, completely still. Watching, I narrowed my eyes, trying desperately to make out the shape. I'm extremely nearsighted. The distance blurred everything together. I couldn't tell who it was, only that someone was there. Every instinct inside me screamed the same thing. Run. Without another second of hesitation, I spun around and sprinted back through the stage door, slamming it shut behind me. My breathing was completely out of control. My hands shook so violently I could barely hold my phone. I searched the building until I found Finn, our head stage manager. The words caught in my throat. I was trembling so badly that I could hardly explain what I'd seen. Finn immediately took me seriously. He stayed calm while I stumbled through everything from the bagel shop to the messages to the fake accounts to the figure outside. He told me to wait in the green room while he checked the parking lot first. Several minutes later, he returned. He hadn't found anyone. I wanted to believe that meant I had imagined it. Then my phone vibrated. Another direct message. I opened it. Only one sentence. "I like you in blue." My blood ran cold. I hadn't posted any photos wearing blue that day. The only blue I'd worn was the blue costume for rehearsal. He hadn't guessed. He had seen me. He was there. The tears came instantly. I completely broke down. Finn stayed with me long after everyone else had gone home, refusing to let me leave alone. Eventually, he walked beside me through the empty parking lot. Every shadow suddenly looked like someone hiding. Every tree, every dumpster, every parked car, every corner of the fence. I kept expecting someone to step out at any second. We finally reached my car. My shaking hand reached for the driver's door. Then I saw them. Two unmistakable handprints, pressed clearly against the driver's side window, fresh enough to catch the light. For a moment, the entire world seemed to stop. I hadn't imagined the figure. Someone really had been standing there, waiting, watching, close enough to touch my car, close enough to leave proof. My mind desperately searched for an explanation. Then all at once the answer hit me. My Instagram story. Earlier that week, I'd proudly reposted the theater's cast announcement, the theater's name, its location, its address. I hadn't told him where I'd be. I had unknowingly shown him, and he had come looking. The realization haunted me for days. I wanted to scream at myself for making such a simple, careless mistake. One Instagram story, one innocent repost celebrating the cast announcement. That was all it had taken. Without realizing it, I had handed him the exact location of the theater. I had unknowingly drawn a map straight to me. And now, he knew exactly where I'd be every evening for the rest of the week. The thought never left my mind. Every rehearsal suddenly felt different. Every shadow outside the building made my pulse spike. Every unfamiliar face in the parking lot became a possible threat. Finn never let me walk to my car alone again. Every single night after rehearsal, he insisted on escorting me across the dark parking lot. He joked around to keep me calm, but I could tell he was constantly scanning our surroundings just as much as I was. His kindness probably kept me from completely falling apart. Even then, sleep became almost impossible. Every creak in the house jolted me awake. Every vibration from my phone made my heart leap into my throat. I kept lying awake, wondering the same terrifying questions. If he had managed to find the theater, could he find my workplace? Could he find my home? Would I look out my bedroom window one night and see him standing across the street? There was no longer any sense of privacy. Every routine I'd spent years building suddenly felt like a weakness. So I started erasing myself. I stopped posting Instagram stories until I was safely back home. I drove different routes to work every day. I varied the times I left. I warned everyone at the theater about him. I completely stopped going to the little bagel shop where this nightmare had begun. I hoped that if he couldn't predict my movements, maybe he'd eventually lose interest. Instead, it only seemed to make him angrier. My phone became a weapon he used against me. Every few hours, another fake account appeared. Another flood of notifications. Another stream of messages. This time there was no attempt to sound charming. The frustration poured through every sentence. Why aren't you coming into the shop anymore? Where did you go? You should have been at work. You're hiding from me. Where are you? Tell me where you are. Then came the message that made my stomach twist into knots. I can find you whenever I want. I stared at those words for what felt like forever. It wasn't simply harassment anymore. It sounded like a promise. Or maybe a warning. For days I wrestled with myself. Was I overreacting? Would the police think I was wasting their time? People get strange messages online every day. Maybe this was just another obsessed stranger. Maybe he'd eventually get bored. But deep down, another voice kept repeating the facts. He had searched for every one of my social media accounts. He knew where I worked. He had tracked down the theater. He had stood beside my car. He had watched me during rehearsal. This wasn't happening online anymore. It was happening in my real life. Opening weekend was getting closer. Instead of feeling excited, I dreaded every performance. The theater staff promised they would keep an eye out for him. They assured me I wouldn't be alone. I wanted desperately to believe them. Opening night passed. Then, another performance. I deliberately avoided going into the lobby afterward because none of my friends or family were attending. I thought staying backstage would keep me hidden. I was wrong. After the Saturday matinee, one of the cast members hurried backstage looking for me. "You have flowers," she said with a smile. For one brief, hopeful second, I relaxed. Maybe one of my college friends had surprised me. Maybe my parents had sent them. Maybe. She handed me the bouquet. The second I saw the note tucked between the roses, my heart dropped. I already knew. The handwriting wasn't familiar, but somehow, I knew. The note read that he was disappointed I hadn't come out after the show to meet him. He mentioned that I hadn't returned to the bagel shop. He noticed I wasn't parking in my usual space at work anymore. Then, he wrote something that made my blood run cold. He said he would be patient, as though waiting was simply part of his plan. Then came the final lines. "The roses will look beautiful in your bedroom. You don't need the stage manager to walk you to your car. You have me." I couldn't breathe. Those weren't the words of someone with an innocent crush. Those were the words of someone who believed he already belonged in my life. Someone who believed my safety depended on him. Someone who had been watching far more than I had realized. My hands were shaking as I carried the flowers and notes straight to theater management. What they discovered made everything even worse. One of the recently hired box office employees had unknowingly let him inside. He had calmly introduced himself as my boyfriend. He asked where I would come out after the performance because he wanted to surprise me. No one questioned him. Why would they? He sounded believable. He sounded normal. That's the terrifying thing about predators. They rarely look dangerous. They often appear polite, friendly, patient. Exactly the kind of person no one thinks to question. Then came another horrifying discovery. He hadn't bought a ticket for just one performance. He had purchased tickets for every single show in the entire production. Every night, every performance, every opportunity to watch. An emergency meeting was called before rehearsal resumed. The director explained the situation to the entire cast and crew. Security was immediately notified. His tickets were canceled. His name and photograph were distributed to everyone working at the theater. He was permanently banned from entering the building. For the first time in weeks, I felt the smallest sense of relief. Since then, I haven't received any more messages. I'm currently trying to obtain a restraining order and hoping it provides enough protection if he ever decides to come back. Even now, years later, one lesson from that experience has never left me. The most frightening people are not always the ones who shout, threaten, or reveal themselves immediately. Sometimes they begin with a smile, a simple act of kindness, a harmless conversation lasting only a few minutes, and by the time you realize they've quietly inserted themselves into every corner of your life, they're already much closer than you ever imagined. This happened back in 2018. For context, I live in Northern Ireland on a quiet residential street with a long row of small shops directly across from my house. At the very end of those shops sits a pharmacy, the first building anyone sees when turning onto our street. Normally, it's an ordinary place. During the day, it's busy with customers, parked cars, and people coming and going. But after midnight, the entire area transforms. The storefronts become black mirrors. The sidewalks empty. Every sound carries farther than it should. That night, it was around 2:80 a.m. when I left a friend's house and started driving home. I remember feeling exhausted. The kind of exhaustion where your body moves automatically while your mind is already imagining climbing into bed. The roads were almost deserted. Streetlights cast long pools of pale orange light across the pavement, broken only by deep pockets of darkness between them. As I turned toward my street, my headlights swept across the row of closed shops. That's when I noticed someone standing outside the pharmacy. A lone figure, completely motionless. At first, I barely registered it. My sleepy brain immediately reached for the most ordinary explanation. Probably someone who'd had too much to drink. Maybe someone waiting for a taxi. Or perhaps just someone out for a late-night walk. I kept driving. I had no idea that within moments that silent figure would become something I would remember for years. As I got closer to the entrance of my street, something immediately caught my attention. The figure hadn't moved, not even an inch. Whoever it was remained standing directly in front of the pharmacy doors, perfectly still, as though they had been frozen in place the entire time. The streetlights barely reached them, but there was enough light for me to make out their clothing. Everything was black. Black jacket, black trousers, dark shoes. The figure blended so naturally into the shadows that it almost looked less like a person and more like a silhouette cut out of the night itself. Even from inside my locked car with the engine humming beneath me, an uncomfortable feeling crept into my chest. There was something deeply unnatural about the way they stood. Most people waiting outside a shop shift their weight. They check their phones. They glance around. They fidget. This person did none of those things. They simply stood there, watching. Or perhaps, waiting. I had lived on this street for most of my life, and over the years I'd heard plenty of stories about attempted break-ins at the pharmacy. It wasn't exactly common, but it had happened often enough that the thought entered my mind almost immediately. Was I about to witness someone trying to rob the place? Curiosity got the better of me. Instead of driving straight home, I slowed my car as I turned onto my street, hoping to get a better look. The moment my headlights swept fully across the figure, everything changed. My stomach dropped so violently it almost felt like missing a step on a staircase. Without warning, the figure lifted both hands and covered their face, not shielding their eyes from the headlights, not waving, covering their face completely. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost rehearsed. For the first time, I noticed they were wearing black leather gloves. The headlights reflected faintly off the smooth leather before the figure slowly turned their head following my car as it rolled past. Their hands never left their face. They simply tracked me, silently, patiently, as though they didn't want me to see who they were, but wanted to make absolutely certain they saw me. Every instinct inside me screamed that something was terribly wrong. I instinctively pressed harder on the accelerator. The distance between us grew quickly. Then I made what I still consider one of the stupidest decisions of my life. Operating entirely on habit, I turned into my driveway. It wasn't a conscious choice. My body simply followed the route it had driven thousands of times before. The second my car stopped, reality crashed into me. I had just shown that stranger exactly where I lived. My chest tightened. I sat frozen behind the steering wheel, gripping it so tightly my fingers began to ache. For several long seconds, I couldn't even bring myself to look back toward the shops. Eventually, I forced myself to glance into the rearview mirror. The pavement outside the pharmacy was empty. For the briefest moment, relief washed over me. Then another thought struck me with far greater force. If he wasn't standing there anymore, where had he gone? I had passed him no more than 20 seconds earlier. There wasn't enough time for someone to simply disappear, unless they had gone somewhere I couldn't see. I scanned the shadows between the parked cars. Nothing. The alley beside the shops. Nothing. The road. Nothing. That silence was somehow worse than if I'd still seen him standing there, because now I had no idea where he was. I took a slow breath, unlocked my car door, and stepped outside. The night suddenly felt unnaturally quiet. No passing traffic. No distant conversations. Not even the sound of wind. Only my own breathing. The moment my feet touched, the driveway instinct took over. I sprinted. I don't think I've ever run that fast before or since. I reached my front door, shoved the key into the lock with shaking hands, nearly dropped it twice, then stumbled inside and slammed the door shut behind me. I immediately locked every lock. Only then did I finally allow myself to breathe. My heart felt as though it was trying to pound its way out of my chest. Trying to convince myself I was overreacting, I texted a few friends to let them know I'd made it home safely. I mentioned the strange man outside the pharmacy. Their responses came back quickly. "You probably interrupted someone. You scared him off. You're overthinking it." Reading those messages actually helped. For a little while, I even considered calling the police. But then I questioned myself. What would I actually report? A man standing outside a closed pharmacy? Someone covering their face when headlights hit them? Technically, he hadn't committed a crime, at least not one I'd witnessed. Eventually, exhaustion won. I convinced myself it had simply been one of those strange late-night encounters people tell stories about years later. Nothing more. My bedroom sits at the front of the house, directly facing the row of shops across the street. Before getting into bed, I pulled back the blinds one final time. The pharmacy stood dark and empty. The pavement was deserted. No movement. No figure. Nothing. Satisfied, I let the blinds fall closed. Like every other summer night, I left my bedroom window slightly open to let the cool air in. Within minutes, I was asleep. I still don't know how much time had passed when I suddenly woke up. It wasn't gradual. There was no bad dream. No nightmare. One moment, I was deeply asleep. The next, I was wide awake. Completely alert. At first, I couldn't understand why. I'm an incredibly heavy sleeper. Thunder rarely wakes me. Neither do passing cars. Yet something had pulled me violently out of sleep. I remained perfectly still beneath the covers. My room was almost completely dark. The digital clock glowed faintly on my bedside table. I listened. Nothing. For several long moments, there was only silence. Then I heard it. A faint humming. So soft that for a second I wondered if I had imagined it. I held my breath. Several seconds passed. Then it came again. Slow, steady. Almost absent-minded. The kind of tune someone hums while waiting, or while patiently passing the time. Every hair on my arm stood up. The sound wasn't coming from inside the house. It wasn't coming from a neighboring room. It was coming from outside. Right beneath my bedroom window, someone was standing outside in the darkness, humming quietly to themselves. I reached over to my bedside table and checked the time on my phone. 3:30 a.m. And the glowing numbers seemed almost unreal. My entire body went rigid. The humming was still there. Soft, slow, patient. It drifted through the crack I'd left in my bedroom window, just loud enough that I couldn't convince myself it was my imagination anymore. Who hums outside someone's bedroom at 3:30 in the morning? For a few desperate seconds, my mind searched for any explanation that sounded remotely reasonable. Maybe someone was walking home after a night out. Maybe someone had stopped outside for a cigarette. Maybe the sound was traveling from farther away than I thought. But none of those explanations survived for long. Deep down, I already knew. The sound wasn't moving. It wasn't fading into the distance. It was staying exactly where it was, right outside my window. Then another realization hit me so hard it almost knocked the breath from my lungs. My bedroom window was still slightly open. The moment I remembered that, genuine panic set in. It's difficult to describe the feeling of lying in complete darkness, knowing there could be another human being standing only a few feet away, hidden by the night, separated from you by nothing more than a thin sheet of glass and a partially open window. The distance between us suddenly felt terrifyingly small. If that person wanted to, they could force the window open, climb inside, be standing beside my bed before I even had a chance to react, and I was completely alone. No family, no roommates, no one sleeping in the next room, no one who would hear me immediately if something happened. The realization settled over me like ice water. For several long moments I couldn't think. My mind was racing in every direction at once, desperately searching for the safest decision. Call the police? No. If I started speaking into my phone, whoever was outside would immediately know I was awake. Would that provoke them? Would they panic? Would they try to come inside before help arrived? The possibilities played through my mind in terrifying detail. Finally, I settled on what seemed like the least dangerous plan. Quietly get out of bed, close the window, lock it, then call the police. Simple. At least it sounded simple. In reality, every movement felt impossible. I slowly lifted the blankets away, careful not to let the mattress creak. My bare feet touched the cold floor. I moved inch by inch through the darkness, trying to make less noise than my own breathing. My hands were shaking so violently that I wasn't sure I'd even be able to turn the window latch. Then, the humming stopped. Instantly. The silence that followed somehow felt even worse. Silence meant one thing. Whoever had been making that sound was no longer distracted. They were listening. Maybe listening to me. I suddenly became painfully aware of something else. My heartbeat. It thundered inside my chest so violently that I genuinely wondered if it could be heard through the open window. Each beat felt impossibly loud. I stood frozen for several seconds, trying to slow my breathing. Then with trembling fingers I reached toward the blinds. Every instinct told me not to look. Every horror story I'd ever heard warned against confirming what your mind already fears. But I had to know. Slowly, carefully, I pulled the blinds aside. What I saw on the other side is, without question, the most horrifying image I've ever witnessed. He was there, standing directly outside my bedroom window, so close that only the glass separated us. In that instant, every piece of the puzzle snapped together. The man outside the pharmacy had never disappeared. He hadn't walked away. He hadn't gone home. The only explanation that made sense was that he had hidden somewhere nearby after watching me pull into my driveway. He had waited, watched me enter the house, seen my bedroom light switch on, watched me close the blinds. He knew exactly which room belonged to me. He had chosen to stand outside it. Just like before, he wore black leather gloves. Both hands covered his face, but this time, his fingers were spread apart ever so slightly, just enough to leave a narrow gap. Behind that gap, one eye, unblinking, fixed directly on mine. Time seemed to stop. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. He simply stared. There was something deeply unsettling about the complete absence of movement. Most people caught outside someone's window would run, hide, look away. He did none of those things. He wanted me to know he was there. He wanted me to know he was watching. Then, almost imperceptibly, the corner of his mouth curled upward beneath the edge of the gloves. A slow smile. Not a grin, not laughter. Just the smallest hint of satisfaction. As though he had been waiting for the exact moment our eyes met. The terror that had been building inside me finally exploded. I screamed. I stumbled backwards so violently that I nearly fell over my bed. My phone slipped from my shaking hands before I grabbed it again and dialed 999. I was crying so hard that I could barely get the words out. The emergency operator repeatedly asked me to slow down because she couldn't understand what I was saying. Those few minutes waiting for the police felt endless. Every second seemed to stretch into an eternity. I couldn't bring myself to look back toward the window again. I simply sat on the floor, shaking uncontrollably, staring at the bedroom door as if that somehow felt safer. Then, at last, blue and red lights flashed across my bedroom walls through the closed blinds. I've never experienced relief quite like that. Officers searched around the outside of my house. They checked the gardens, the alleyways, the neighboring properties, every possible place someone could hide. He was gone, as though he'd vanished into the darkness. The only physical evidence they found that night was across the street. The pharmacy door had been smashed. The reinforced security shutter had prevented anyone from getting inside. Whoever had attempted the break-in had failed. The officers suggested something that has stayed with me ever since. They believed the man had noticed me slowing my car to watch him. Maybe he followed me simply because I had witnessed him preparing to commit a crime. Maybe he wanted to intimidate me into keeping quiet. Or maybe there had been another reason entirely. One I'll thankfully never know. Years have passed since that night. I still live in the same house. I've never seen that man again. At least, not that I'm aware of. But every time I drive home late at night, I instinctively glance toward that pharmacy, toward the exact stretch of pavement where he first stood perfectly still beneath the streetlights. Even after all these years, I can't help wondering what would have happened if I had looked out that window just a few minutes later. Or worse, if I had forgotten to lock it. Before the experience I'm about to tell you, I never thought twice about living alone. At 19 years old, independence felt exciting rather than frightening. After finally escaping a miserable living situation with roommates, having a place entirely to myself felt like the beginning of a better chapter in my life. I worked full-time as a server at a chain restaurant not far from my hometown. The pay wasn't amazing, but it was steady just enough to afford a modest apartment and cover my bills. A small apartment complex only a few minutes from work seemed like the perfect fit. It wasn't luxurious. It wasn't in the nicest part of town, but it looked quiet, affordable, and most importantly, safe enough for someone living alone. Like many inexpensive apartment complexes, it had its share of noisy neighbors and occasional late-night arguments echoing through the parking lot. Still, nothing ever happened that made me feel genuinely unsafe. For the first several months, life settled into an almost comforting routine. Wake up, go to work, come home, repeat. Outside of work, I rarely went anywhere. Most days, the only reasons I left my apartment were to collect my mail from the leasing office or take my trash to the dumpsters behind the buildings. It was an ordinary life, predictable, peaceful. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder if that ordinary routine was exactly what allowed someone else to begin learning it just as well as I did. Those short trips became part of my routine, checking the mailbox, taking out the trash. Neither errand required me to leave the apartment complex. Both were less than half a mile from my front door, close enough that I never thought twice about locking up and leaving for a few minutes. At the time, they felt insignificant. Looking back now, I realize those brief moments were the only windows of opportunity someone would have needed. For the first few months, living alone was exactly what I had hoped it would be. Peaceful, predictable, comfortably ordinary. Then, almost without warning, that sense of security began to disappear. It didn't happen all at once. It started with a feeling. One afternoon, after finishing another shift at the restaurant, I unlocked my apartment and stepped inside. Immediately, something felt wrong. There wasn't any obvious sign of danger. Nothing had been knocked over. Nothing appeared broken. No strange noises echoed through the rooms. Yet the atmosphere felt different in a way that's almost impossible to explain. People often describe the sensation of feeling watched. This wasn't that. It felt more like walking into a room after someone else had quietly left. The air itself seemed disturbed, as though my apartment no longer belonged exclusively to me. I tried convincing myself I was imagining it. Maybe work had exhausted me. Maybe I was simply being overly sensitive. My apartment sat on the second floor, so I climbed the familiar staircase leading into the open living room connected to the small kitchen. Halfway up the stairs, everything still looked perfectly normal. Then I reached the top step. I stopped dead. Large, muddy footprints stretched across my living room carpet. Not one or two, dozens. Dark brown impressions led from the entrance, crossed the entire room, and disappeared into the kitchen. They were unmistakably adult-sized, far larger than my own shoes, fresh enough that clumps of dried mud had broken away onto the carpet. For several seconds I couldn't move. My brain refused to process what I was seeing. Someone had walked through my apartment. Someone who definitely wasn't me. Looking back, I know what I should have done. I should have left immediately. I should have called the police. Instead, curiosity overpowered common sense. My heart pounding against my ribs, I cautiously walked toward the kitchen to see whether someone was still inside. The room was empty. Only more muddy footprints. The kitchen was too small for anyone to hide. No closets. No concealed spaces. Just footprints disappearing around the counters as though someone had calmly wandered around before leaving. Adrenaline took over. I searched every room. Bathroom. Bedroom. Closets. Under the bed. Behind the shower curtain. Everywhere. Nothing. No intruder. No sign of forced entry. No explanation. Once I was certain I was alone, another frightening realization crept into my mind. What had they taken? I rushed through the apartment checking everything. My television, laptop, wallet, jewelry, cash, nothing. Absolutely nothing was missing. Oddly enough, that unsettled me even more than if I'd discovered a burglary. If someone breaks into your home and steals your belongings, at least their motive makes sense. But what kind of person walks through someone else's apartment, leaves muddy footprints everywhere, and takes absolutely nothing? Desperate for an explanation, I called the leasing office. The management company wasn't exactly known for being organized. I convinced myself there had to be a simple answer. Maybe maintenance workers had entered to inspect something. Maybe they forgot to notify me. Maybe someone had accidentally been given the wrong key. The woman at the office checked their records. Then came the answer I had secretly been hoping not to hear. No maintenance requests. No inspections. No scheduled visits. According to their records, no employee had entered my apartment that day. The call ended, but my anxiety didn't. If it wasn't maintenance, then who had been inside? One of my closest friends lived in the same apartment complex only a few streets away. I called him immediately and explained everything I'd found. To my frustration, he laughed. He told me I was overthinking it. You probably walked through with muddy boots after work and forgot. I remember sitting there in complete disbelief. Forget? How do you forget covering your entire apartment in mud? How do you forget leaving footprints across every room? I knew exactly what shoes I'd worn that day. They'd never touched mud. I wasn't mistaken. I wasn't imagining it. And I certainly wasn't crazy. Still, without proof, I had nothing except my own certainty. Several days passed without another incident. Gradually, I began convincing myself the nightmare was over. Maybe there really had been some bizarre misunderstanding. Even so, I became almost obsessive about security. Every time I left, I checked the locks twice, sometimes 3 times. Every window, every door, every latch. I developed little routines to reassure myself that everything had been secured before leaving. For a while, those routines worked. They gave me just enough peace of mind to function normally again, until the apartment began changing in much subtler ways. Nothing dramatic, nothing that immediately screamed intruder, just small details. The kind of details that make you question your own memory before you question reality. One afternoon, I opened the refrigerator to grab a drink. The large gallon of water I'd bought only the day before was sitting on the kitchen counter. The seal had been broken. Nearly half the water was gone. I stared at it for several moments, trying to remember opening it. Nothing. I had specifically placed it in the refrigerator because I preferred cold water. I couldn't remember taking it out. I couldn't remember drinking any of it. A few days later, I walked inside after work and was hit by an unbearable wave of heat. The apartment felt almost tropical. I checked the thermostat. Someone had turned the heat all the way up to its maximum setting. That made even less sense. I paid the utility bills myself. There was absolutely no reason I'd intentionally waste money heating an apartment that hot while I was gone. The incidents were so small that each one taken individually almost seemed ridiculous. An open water jug, a thermostat, tiny details, yet together, they formed a disturbing pattern. It felt as though someone wasn't trying to steal from me. They were using my apartment, touching my belongings, moving things just enough for me to notice, almost as if they wanted me to wonder whether I'd imagined it. Each time something happened, I called my friend. Each time he gave me the same answer. You forgot. You're stressed. You're imagining connections that aren't there. His explanations sounded logical. In fact, they sounded exactly like the explanations I desperately wanted to believe, because the alternative was far more terrifying. If I wasn't forgetting, if my memory wasn't failing, then someone had been entering my apartment over and over again. Not to rob me, not to vandalize anything, not to hurt me. At least, not yet. They simply came and went, quietly, patiently, leaving behind only enough evidence to make me question my own sanity. And perhaps that was the most frightening possibility of all. Because if someone is willing to enter your home without taking anything, you have to ask yourself one question. What were they really coming there for? One detail haunted me more than anything else. Nothing was ever stolen. As a server, I almost always came home with cash. Tips, loose bills, and handfuls of coins often sat on my kitchen counter or coffee table for days before I bothered putting them away. Anyone breaking into my apartment could have walked out with easy money in less than 30 seconds. They never touched a single dollar. My laptop remained exactly where I left it. My television was untouched. Game consoles, headphones, electronics. Even small valuables that could have been slipped into a backpack without me ever noticing. Everything stayed exactly where it belonged. At first, that almost comforted me. Then I realized it was actually far more disturbing. A burglar has a motive. A thief wants something. But if someone repeatedly enters your home, walks through every room, moves your belongings, uses your utilities, yet leaves every valuable item behind, then money isn't what they're after. That realization stayed with me long after I tried to push it out of my mind. As the weeks passed, I found myself questioning something I had never questioned before, my own sanity. Every time another strange incident happened, I replayed the day in my head over and over again. Did I really leave the water in the refrigerator? Maybe I drank it without thinking. Did I accidentally adjust the thermostat? Maybe I was simply exhausted after work. Did I lock the door? Of course I did. Didn't I? The worst part wasn't the fear. It was the self-doubt. My friend's voice echoed constantly in my head. You're just forgetting. You're stressed. You're paranoid. Eventually, I started wondering if he was right. Maybe I was becoming absent-minded. Maybe I was losing track of things. Maybe living alone was affecting me more than I realized. Or maybe someone really was inside my apartment whenever I wasn't. For nearly 2 months, I lived between those two possibilities. Without proof, I couldn't convince anyone. Without evidence, I couldn't even convince myself. Eventually, I stopped bringing it up. Not because I believed it had stopped. Because I was tired of sounding crazy. Then one summer night, everything changed. I had just finished another late shift at the restaurant. By the time I pulled into the apartment complex, it was around 11:00 p.m. The parking lot was almost empty. Most apartment windows were dark. The silence felt unusually heavy. I climbed the familiar staircase toward my apartment keys already in my hand. I remember thinking only about taking a shower and collapsing into bed. Then I reached my door. My key stopped halfway to the lock. The door wasn't closed, not wide open, just slightly ajar, barely an inch, just enough to notice. My blood instantly ran cold. I stared at it, trying to convince myself my eyes were playing tricks on me. They weren't. The latch wasn't engaged. The door had been opened. I stood there completely frozen. One thought after another slammed into my mind. I know I locked it. I always lock it. Especially since everything started happening. There was absolutely no chance I had left for work with the door sitting open. Then another terrifying thought hit me. My cat. A few weeks earlier, I'd adopted a young rescue cat. He had never been outside. If the door had been open for hours, he could have escaped, or worse. Someone could have taken him. Looking back, I know exactly what I should have done. I should have backed away, called the police, waited outside. Instead, panic overruled reason. I shoved the door open and rushed inside alone. Every room echoed with silence. Buddy. I called for my cat, my voice shaking. Seconds later, he emerged from the bedroom completely unharmed. Relief flooded through me so quickly that my knees nearly gave out. But that relief lasted only a moment, because now, there was no denying reality anymore. Someone had opened my apartment door while I was gone. No forgotten memory could explain that. No misplaced item. No faulty recollection. This time, I knew, without question. Someone had been inside. From that day forward, I decided I needed proof. Real proof. Not feelings. Not strange memories. Evidence. Before leaving my apartment each morning, I began placing a small strip of clear tape across the bottom edge of my front door. It was almost invisible. If the door stayed shut, the tape would remain perfectly intact. If anyone opened it, even slightly, the tape would peel away or shift. It became my silent witness. Each evening when I returned home, I checked the tape before anything else. The first day, it had moved. The second day, gone. The third, broken. Then again, and again, and again. Every single time, it didn't matter whether I had been gone 10 hours or 10 minutes. The result was always the same. Someone had opened my door. Not once, not twice, countless times. The tape confirmed what my instincts had been screaming for months. Someone wasn't merely trespassing. Someone was returning, repeatedly. As the weeks passed, the intrusions became bolder. Sometimes I came home to find my apartment door standing several inches open. Other times it was left almost halfway ajar. It no longer seemed like the person cared whether I noticed. In fact, it almost felt intentional, as though they wanted me to know they had been there. The most terrifying part was how quickly it happened. Remember those short trips I mentioned earlier? Walking to the leasing office, taking trash to the dumpsters. Both locations were less than a couple of minutes away. Even during those tiny absences, I would return to find the tape disturbed, the door open. That realization changed everything. Whoever this person was, they weren't choosing random times to enter. They knew exactly when I left. They knew exactly when I would return. That meant only one thing. Someone was watching me, watching my routine, watching my apartment, watching me. Fear slowly transformed into something else. Anger. I was furious. Furious that a stranger had stolen the feeling of safety inside my own home. Furious that everyone around me dismissed my concerns. Furious that I couldn't catch whoever was doing this. Every day became exhausting. I'd leave for work wondering if someone would enter before I came home. I'd unlock my apartment expecting to find evidence that I'd been there, but someone else had been there too. Eventually, I stopped hoping it would end on its own. I contacted the police. Officers advised me to document everything. Every suspicious incident. Every open door. Every unexplained disturbance. Every time the tape had been broken. They explained that even if they couldn't immediately identify the intruder, creating a detailed paper trail could become crucial if the person was eventually caught. So I filed report after report, each one describing another violation, another intrusion, another reminder that someone considered my apartment their own. Weeks turned into months, yet nothing changed. No arrests, no suspects, no answers, only the same relentless pattern. The harassment became so constant that something inside me quietly broke. I no longer came home expecting my apartment to be secure. Instead, I expected the front door to be open. And almost every single time, it was. Somehow that routine became even more terrifying than the first day. Because fear isn't always loud. Sometimes the worst kind of horror is waking up one day and realizing you've begun treating the impossible as completely normal. By that point, I wasn't just uncomfortable. I was exhausted. Living in that apartment no longer felt like living in my own home. It felt like sharing it with someone I could never see. Every time I left for work, I wondered who might be walking through my front door after I pulled away. Every time I came home, I prepared myself to discover another subtle reminder that someone had been inside while I was gone. The apartment had become a place where I could never truly relax. Eventually, I reached my breaking point. I contacted the leasing office and explained everything that had been happening over the previous months. The unexplained footprints, the moved belongings, the broken tape, the unlocked door, the constant feeling that someone was entering my apartment whenever I wasn't there. I told them I no longer felt safe living there. I begged them to let me terminate my lease early. I wasn't asking for compensation. I wasn't demanding anything unreasonable. I simply wanted to leave. The response was devastatingly simple. No, according to them, there wasn't enough evidence that anyone had actually broken into the apartment. Without proof of forced entry or a confirmed crime, they refused to release me from my lease. Nor did they offer any meaningful solution. No additional locks. No security improvements. No temporary relocation. Nothing. When that conversation ended, I realized something terrifying. I was trapped. Either I continued living in an apartment where I believed someone entered regularly, or I paid thousands of dollars I couldn't afford just to leave. Neither option felt possible. The police could only do so much. I continued filing report after report, documenting every suspicious incident. Each officer treated me respectfully, but the answer remained the same. Without solid evidence, there was very little they could do. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no surveillance footage, only my growing collection of reports describing a person who seemed determined to remain invisible. Eventually, I accepted something I never thought I would. This was simply my life now. Every day began with anxiety. Every evening ended with uncertainty. I counted the months remaining on my lease the way prisoners count the days until release. Then, on one quiet afternoon, everything changed. It was my first day off in what felt like forever. I decided to stay home, relax, and enjoy having nowhere to be. The apartment was unusually quiet, almost peaceful. I walked into my living room without thinking. Then I stopped. Something looked wrong, not moved, missing. My eyes settled on the television stand. For several seconds, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. The shelf beneath the television was empty. My gaming console was gone. So were several other electronic devices I'd kept beside it. The empty space where they should have been looked almost surreal. I stood there, frozen. Oddly enough, the first emotion I felt wasn't fear. It was validation. After months of being told I was paranoid, after months of questioning my own memory, after months of wondering whether I had imagined everything, there it was. Proof. Undeniable. Visible. Someone had entered my apartment. Someone had finally taken something. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, no one could tell me I was imagining it. No one could suggest I had simply forgotten. No one could explain it away. It sounds strange to admit now, but seeing those stolen electronics almost felt like a victory. Not because losing my belongings was a good thing, far from it, but because theft finally gave a clear explanation for months of unexplained terror. In some twisted way, it was actually less frightening than the alternative I'd been living with. Before, I'd been forced to imagine an unknown stranger wandering through my apartment for reasons I couldn't understand, touching my belongings, opening my refrigerator, adjusting my thermostat, walking through my rooms while I was miles away, doing who knows what. Now, at least there was a recognizable motive. A thief. That explanation, as disturbing as it was, somehow felt easier to comprehend than the thought of someone entering my apartment simply because they wanted to be there. I immediately called the police. Then I called my friend. When I told him what had happened, there was a long silence on the other end of the phone. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer another logical explanation. He didn't tell me I was being paranoid. When he arrived and saw the empty space for himself, the expression on his face said everything. Shock, disbelief, and guilt. He apologized over and over again for dismissing everything I'd been trying to tell him for months. Only now did he realize that every strange incident, every muddy footprint, every broken strip of tape, every unexplained change inside my apartment had almost certainly been real. The police documented the stolen property and added another report to the growing file. Unfortunately, even with the theft, there still wasn't enough evidence to identify whoever had been entering my apartment. No suspects, no arrests, no answers. But after that day, something changed. My friend refused to leave me dealing with the situation alone. He began checking on my apartment whenever he could. Sometimes he'd drive through the complex while I was working just to make sure nothing looked unusual. On several occasions, he even let me keep his dog while I was away. The dog wasn't professionally trained for protection. He wasn't a guard dog. He was simply another living presence inside the apartment. Someone or something that would make it much harder for an intruder to believe the apartment was empty. Whether that actually discouraged whoever had been entering, I'll never know. What I do know is that the disturbances became far less frequent after that. No more missing tape. No more mysteriously open doors. No more moved belongings. At least, nothing that I noticed. Eventually, the final weeks of my lease arrived. I've never been happier to pack boxes in my life. Every item I carried down those stairs felt like reclaiming a small piece of the security I'd lost. The day I handed over my keys, I didn't look back. Some mysteries are never solved. To this day, I have no idea who repeatedly entered my apartment. I don't know how they got inside. I don't know how long they had been watching me. I don't know whether they lived nearby, worked nearby, or simply chose me at random. The only thing I know for certain is this. For months, someone treated my home as though it belonged to them just as much as it belonged to me, and they disappeared without leaving behind a single answer. 4 years passed. Life slowly returned to normal. The fear faded into something that felt more like a distant nightmare than a memory. I eventually met the person who would become my spouse. For the first time in years, I finally felt as though that chapter of my life had been left behind. Or at least, that's what I believed. 4 years passed. With enough time, even the worst experiences begin to feel distant. The fear never truly disappeared, but it slowly became something I could pack away in the back of my mind, a nightmare I convinced myself had finally ended. Life moved forward. I met the person who would eventually become my spouse, and together we began looking for our first apartment. Like most young couples, money was tight. We needed somewhere affordable, somewhere close to work, somewhere we could realistically manage while building our lives together. Unfortunately, one place checked every box. The same apartment complex. The very place where my life had unraveled years earlier. The idea alone made my stomach tighten. I swore I would never set foot there again. Not after everything that had happened. Not after months of living with the constant certainty that someone was entering my home whenever I left. But practical decisions often outweigh emotional ones. Years had passed. The person responsible, if there even had been one, was surely gone by now. Besides, I wouldn't be living alone this time. There would always be someone else in the apartment. Someone beside me. Someone who would notice if anything strange happened. Reluctantly, I agreed. For a while, everything was exactly as it should have been. Peaceful. Ordinary. No mysterious footsteps. No open doors. No moved belongings. No terrifying feeling that unseen eyes were following my every move. Gradually, I allowed myself to believe that whatever had happened years earlier belonged firmly in the past. Then, one ordinary afternoon, everything came rushing back. I had just finished unloading groceries from the car. With several bags balanced awkwardly in my arms, I was making my way toward the apartment when someone called my name. I turned around. A maintenance worker from the complex was walking toward me. He smiled politely. Nothing about him seemed threatening, at first. Then he asked a question that instantly made every muscle in my body tighten. "Weren't you the one who used to live over there?" He pointed, not toward my current apartment, toward my old one, the exact apartment where everything had happened years before. The grocery bags suddenly felt much heavier. How did he know that? More importantly, how did he know my name? For a split second, every instinct inside me screamed that history was repeating itself. Without thinking, I lied. No. The word came out almost automatically. Then I immediately asked him how he knew my name. His answer should have reassured me. Instead, it made me even more uncomfortable. The leasing office told me. My heart skipped. Why would the office be discussing former tenants with maintenance workers? Why did anyone remember me after all these years? I instinctively took a step backward. The change in my posture must have been obvious. The maintenance worker noticed immediately. His expression changed. The polite smile disappeared. He looked almost sympathetic. Then he quietly said something I had unknowingly been waiting years to hear. "There was a maintenance guy who used to work here." He paused. "He was arrested." I felt my stomach drop. The worker continued. "They fired him after discovering he'd been breaking into women's apartments." For several seconds, I couldn't speak. The world around me seemed strangely quiet. He then looked toward my old apartment before meeting my eyes again. I think he might have been one of his victims. Every unanswered question from the past suddenly began falling into place. The muddy footprints, the opened water jug, the thermostat, the broken tape, the unlocked door, the missing electronics. None of it had been random. None of it had been in my imagination. For years I'd wondered how someone could repeatedly enter my apartment without forcing the door. Now I finally knew. He hadn't needed to break in. He already had a key. As a maintenance employee, he had legitimate access to every apartment in the complex. The realization sent a chill through my entire body. Then came an even more horrifying detail. The maintenance worker casually mentioned where the former employee had lived. Directly across from my apartment, our front doors had faced one another, no more than 50 feet apart. I stood there speechless as everything finally made sense. Every single time I left for work, he saw me leave. Every trip to the mailbox, every walk to the dumpsters, every grocery run, every errand lasting only a few minutes. He had been watching from his own apartment, waiting until my car disappeared, waiting until I turned the corner, then walking across the courtyard with his master key. By the time I returned, he was already back inside his own apartment, watching me come home, watching my confusion, watching me question my own sanity. The speed with which he entered and exited suddenly explained everything that had seemed impossible. He hadn't been lucky. He had been perfectly positioned. For months, the person invading my home had been living almost directly across from me, close enough to learn my schedule, close enough to notice every habit, close enough to know exactly when I was alone. Perhaps the most disturbing realization wasn't that he had access to my apartment. It was that he had almost certainly been observing me long before he ever opened my front door. He knew when I worked. He knew when I slept. He knew when I left. He knew when I came back. He probably knew my routine better than I did. That thought still makes my skin crawl. Oddly enough, hearing the truth brought two completely opposite emotions at the same time: fear and relief. Fear because everything I'd suspected had been real. Relief because I had never been losing my mind. I hadn't imagined the strange atmosphere inside my apartment. I hadn't forgotten locking my door. I hadn't invented the missing tape or the moved belongings. For years I questioned my own memory. I doubted my own instincts. I even wondered if living alone had caused me to become irrational. It hadn't. My instincts had been trying to protect me all along. Even now, years later, I still think about those months more often than I'd like to admit. Sometimes it's something as simple as checking a lock twice before going to bed. Sometimes it's noticing an unfamiliar car parked near my home. Sometimes it's catching myself looking over my shoulder after unlocking my front door. Experiences like that never disappear completely. They simply become part of who you are. Looking back, I know how incredibly fortunate I was. The man had unlimited access to my home. He had countless opportunities to do something far worse than move my belongings or steal electronics. The fact that he didn't is something I'll never stop being grateful for. But that gratitude doesn't erase the fear. If this experience taught me anything, it's that danger rarely announces itself dramatically. Sometimes it begins with a feeling you can't explain. A room that somehow feels different. An object that isn't where you remember leaving it. A door you know you locked. Instinct is often the first alarm your mind sounds long before evidence exists. Too many people ignore it because they don't want to appear paranoid. I almost did the same. If something feels wrong, pay attention. Question it. Document it. Tell someone. You would rather discover you were overly cautious than spend years wishing you had trusted your instincts sooner. Because sometimes, the person you fear is not a stranger hiding in the shadows. Sometimes they're the person carrying the keys.